They say if you stand beneath the Ellison oak at midnight, you will hear the whispers of the daughters, not their voices, but the hollow echoes of girls who were never meant to live past 16. Men who've tried to carve their names into that bark swear their knives bent, as if the tree itself rejected intrusion. But in the summer of 1850, Alabama, the Ellison family didn't speak of curses or whispers or vanishing daughters. They lived in a mansion of white columns and polished mahogany, and from the outside they seemed untouchable. Yet the truth was rotting them from within, an infection no physician could cure. This is not a ghost story, not in the way you've been told them. It is a chronicle of silence, a silence so deep it erased a bloodline. Imagine it, a plantation built on ambition, cruelty, and polished Southern gentility, masking a pact made long before the Ellisons arrived. The family name once commanded respect in Alabama's cotton aristocracy. But wealth cannot seal the cracks when history itself wants payment. Margaret Ellison was the first to disappear just days after her 16th birthday in 1845. No body, no scream, no explanation. The garden where she walked that day was silent, as though it had swallowed her whole. Locals whispered that the girl had been taken, though by what or by whom was left unsaid. 5 years later, in 1850, her youngest sister Sarah reached her 16th year. That was when the truth, long buried, long feared, would surface. But you were never meant to hear this story. Understand that before we go further, what I'm about to reveal was meant to be locked in attics, burned in journals, erased by polite society who knew that the Ellisons were not merely unlucky. They were chosen. Chosen by something older than Alabama, older than Magnolia Hill itself. And here's where you must decide if you want to keep listening, because knowledge is a weapon, and once you hold it, it changes you. What happened to the Ellisons is not confined to the 19th century. It is the same system of silence, manipulation, and sacrifice that still rules the world you live in today. Do you feel it? That heaviness in your chest? That's not fear. That's recognition. You already know, deep down, you've been living inside someone else's story. And tonight, I'm handing you the key to walk out of it. The Ellison plantation was built like a fortress of illusions, a grand deception rising out of the Alabama earth. But every illusion carries a cost, and every cost demands payment in flesh. The locals called the mansion Magnolia Hill, a place of wealth and refinement, but the house itself was a stage designed to blind the world to the cracks running beneath its foundations. White columns reached upward like bleached bones. The polished mahogany staircase gleamed as though it had been carved from the heart of the forest, yet beneath its floorboards, beneath the very soil it was rooted in, lay the remnants of something far older than the Ellison line, something the slaves whispered about but dared not speak aloud in front of their masters. The patriarch, Josiah Ellison, believed himself a self-made man, a titan of industry in the cotton kingdom. But every acre he claimed, every brick laid into his mansion's walls, rested upon a ground already claimed by another power. And the proof came in his children. His son Thomas survived into adulthood, but his daughters were born into a covenant none of them consented to, a covenant signed not in ink, but in silence. Margaret, the eldest, was the first to fall into that silence, vanishing on the cusp of her 16th birthday, erased without a trace. Some said she ran, some said she drowned, some whispered she was taken under the oak tree where no bird would roost, where no shadow fell in the natural way. But the truth was more grotesque, more carefully buried. The Ellisons told no one, not even their closest allies in Montgomery society, because how does a man of Josiah's stature explain that his daughter simply disappeared in daylight, her footprints leading to the meadow, and then ending, as if the earth itself had swallowed her? He explained nothing. He commanded silence, and silence became the Ellisons' curse. Elizabeth, the triarch, polished her silver and smiled through Sunday sermons, but in her eyes lived a dread too sharp to disguise. She carried a silver hand mirror at all times, a Montgomery family heirloom, and though she pretended it was mere vanity, the truth was darker. She watched its surface the way a prisoner watches the door of a cell. By the time Sarah, the youngest daughter, neared her 16th birthday in 1850, the silence had thickened into something suffocating. Neighbors wondered why no portrait of Margaret ever appeared on the walls, why the coming-out ball of Catherine was postponed indefinitely, why Josephine no longer played the pianoforte. The daughters were fading, one by one, like candles snuffed by an unseen hand, and the people whispered, not loud, never loud, that the Ellisons had built their empire on cursed soil, that the tree at the edge of the property was not a tree at all but a marker, a door, a sentry to something vast and old and hungry. But the whispers did not matter, because the Ellisons were powerful, and power hides its rot behind polished wood and polite smiles. Yet rot spreads, and silence is never eternal. It only delays the scream. History remembers Josiah Ellison as a man of ambition, a builder of dynasties. But ambition is a mask that often conceals desperation, and desperation breeds bargains that no one dares admit aloud. He arrived in Alabama with little more than inherited labor and a hunger so sharp it cut through the land itself, and from the very beginning the whispers said he should not have purchased the property that would become Magnolia Hill. Old men in town spoke of blood spilled there long before Josiah's arrival, of Creek rituals beneath the sprawling oak that marked the boundary of the Ellison fields, but Josiah dismissed such talk as superstition, the cowardice of men too weak to claim the riches the soil promised. He carved the plantation out of that ground with sweat and cruelty, expanding his holdings until the Ellison name was spoken with both envy and fear. But the soil remembers, the trees remember, and what is buried does not forget. The first cracks appeared not in Josiah's fortune, but in his bloodline. His son Thomas grew strong, educated, groomed for leadership, but his daughters carried the weight of something unseen, their laughter dimming as they approached the edge of womanhood, as if an unseen clock was ticking down toward a destiny written long before their births. Margaret's disappearance in 1845 should have been enough to break Josiah's pride, but he treated it as an inconvenience, a shame to be buried beneath layers of wealth and spectacle. Catherine followed, her 16th year marked by whispers of fever, though no doctor could name the illness that consumed her. Josephine vanished next, her bed left untouched in the morning, her shoes neatly by the door, as though she had simply walked into the night and dissolved into mist. The community whispered that the Ellison daughters were cursed, but Josiah crushed those whispers with money, with favors, with the quiet power that men of his station wielded like a whip, yet no power silences the truth forever. By the time Sarah approached 16, Elizabeth was a husk of a woman, clutching her silver mirror like it alone kept her tethered to the living, her eyes hollow, her voice trembling in hymns at Sunday service. Servants claimed she muttered strange words in the night, words that bent the air and made candles flicker, words learned from books no Southern lady should have possessed. Still, Josiah stood tall, defiant, hosting dinners, making trades, pretending that silence equaled control. But silence is not control. It is surrender disguised. And as Sarah's birthday drew near, the house itself seemed to breathe with unease, doors opening without cause, mirrors fogging when no fire burned, and in the fields the enslaved whispered of shapes moving among the branches of the oak, shapes that did not belong to this world. They begged Josiah to listen. He refused, and so the covenant, unacknowledged but unbroken, prepared to take its final payment. The morning of Sarah Ellison's 16th birthday arrived not with celebration, but with a dread so heavy it seemed to press against the very walls of Magnolia Hill, as though the house itself knew what the day demanded and could no longer pretend otherwise. The air was thick, the kind of Alabama heat that makes even strong men sluggish, but inside the mansion the stillness felt unnatural, not the laziness of summer, but the suffocation of waiting. Elizabeth paced the corridors, clutching her mirror so tightly her knuckles whitened, pausing at every window that looked toward the oak tree as though expecting to see something standing there, something watching. Josiah, unyielding as ever, ordered the household into motion, preparations for a modest supper. No grand ball this time, no gathering of the county elite, only a quiet observance that he insisted was for Sarah's own health. But the truth was written in the eyes of the servants who moved through the house with downcast stares, as if they feared that even glancing at the youngest Ellison daughter might draw the same doom that had claimed her sisters. Sarah herself was calm, almost unnaturally so, a child of pale skin and golden hair who had grown in the shadow of absence, always aware that her sister's laughter had been silenced before she could truly remember it. She asked no questions of her parents, she offered no protests, but those who watched her that day swore she seemed resigned, as though she had known her fate since birth and was only waiting for the appointed hour. Miss Abigail Porter, the governess whose journals would later provide the only unvarnished record of those days, wrote that Sarah spoke in riddles at breakfast, asking her brother Thomas if he could hear the women singing from the tree line, and when pressed, she only smiled with a sadness that broke even the stern young man's composure. Thomas swore to protect her, to stand guard by her side until the danger had passed, but his words rang hollow in a house where promises had already been broken by silence. By midday, the servants whispered of the old oak more openly than ever, claiming its branches swayed against a motionless sky, that pale figures moved in its shade, though no footsteps marked the ground. Elizabeth wept quietly into her mirror. Josiah barked orders and slammed doors. Thomas stood watch with clenched fists. But beneath it all, the truth was already decided. The covenant was ancient, its payment inevitable, and Sarah Ellison, the last daughter, had been born with her expiration written in silence. As the sun fell toward the horizon on that oppressive July evening, Magnolia Hill seemed to exhale a breath it had been holding all day, and with that release came a weight of inevitability so thick that every soul on the property felt it, from the overseer pacing the veranda to the smallest child in the slave quarters who cried without reason as twilight crept in. The oak tree at the edge of the property stood black against the crimson sky. Its branches, like claws, stretched across the dying light, and though no wind stirred, its leaves whispered as though in conversation. Sarah moved through the house like a figure already half-claimed, her pale dress trailing across polished floors, her bare feet silent against the boards. Elizabeth shadowed her every step, mirror clutched to her chest, muttering prayers not from the Book of Common Prayer, but from something older, words Miss Porter would later describe as a tongue that moved like water over stone, too fluid to belong to English or French. Josiah remained in his study, pouring brandy with trembling hands he would never admit were trembling, his defiance cracking in private though he barked commands in public. Thomas sat at the threshold of Sarah's room, a pistol resting across his knees, the boy transformed into a desperate sentinel who still believed that steel and gunpowder could halt what had claimed his sisters without struggle. The enslaved refused to come near the eastern edge of the property, whispering warnings that the tree's shadow had grown longer than the sun could explain, that the air there carried the scent of wet earth after rain, though the sky had been dry for weeks. They said the ground remembered, that the Ellison land was not the Ellisons at all, but belonged to the women who had died there long before. As darkness settled, Sarah spoke softly to her mother, words that froze Elizabeth's blood. It won't hurt this time. They're only coming to take me home." And with that she turned her gaze toward the oak beyond the window, eyes hollow yet shining, as though she saw not a tree but a doorway. In that moment, the silence of the Ellison house was no longer the silence of denial. It was the silence of surrender, the stillness of prey that knows the predator has already chosen. Night fell heavy over Magnolia Hill. Not the soft darkness of a summer evening, but a suffocating void that pressed against windows and seemed to seep through the cracks in the walls. and those who dared step onto the veranda swore the stars themselves had dimmed above the Ellison estate as though the sky refused to bear witness. The oak stood at the edge of the property like a sentinel carved from shadow, its branches stretching wider than the eye could account for, and beneath it something shifted, too pale, too fluid to be explained by imagination. Sarah, seated in her chamber, rose without hesitation when the clock struck midnight, and those who saw her move later described her as though she were not walking but being drawn, each step compelled by a force older than language. Elizabeth tried to restrain her, clutching her daughter's wrist so tightly the skin whitened, but Sarah only turned to her mother with a calmness that shattered whatever courage remained in the woman's soul. "You knew," Sarah whispered, her voice too deep, too resonant for a girl of 16, and in the silver mirror Elizabeth clutched, a reflection flickered. Hollow-eyed women in white, their mouths moving in unison, though no sound escaped the glass. Thomas, hearing his mother's cry, rushed forward with his pistol raised, but when he aimed at the window where the tree loomed, the weapon grew heavy in his hands, as if the metal itself resisted his command. The candle flames guttered, bending toward the east as though pulled by a tide no mortal could resist, and with them Sarah turned, gliding through the halls of Magnolia Hill toward the open door, toward the meadow that seemed to glow faintly in the unnatural dark. The enslaved watched from a distance, their faces etched with terror, none daring to step closer, though their instincts screamed to intervene, for they knew the oak was not just a tree, but a doorway to something that fed on silence, on bloodlines, on obedience to an unspoken pact. Josiah at last emerged from his study, brandy glass still in hand, shouting Sarah's name, his voice breaking as though his own command of language had betrayed him. But it was too late. The girl was already crossing the meadow, her pale figure merging with the white silhouettes beneath the oak. And then came the sound. A chorus, not carried by air, but vibrating inside every skull on the property, the voices of countless women singing without words, a melody that eroded reason itself, pulling Sarah into the darkness where her sisters had gone before. What happened next was spoken of only in whispers, and written down by none, save for fragments torn from Miss Porter's trembling hand, but those fragments paint a picture of terror that does not fade with time. The meadow was silent except for that impossible chorus, and as Sarah reached the oak, the earth itself seemed to breathe, grass bending though no wind stirred, soil pulsing like the slow beat of a buried heart. Figures emerged from the tree line, women draped in white garments not of the current century, but of centuries past, their eyes hollow voids that swallowed candlelight, their movements synchronized as though they shared a single will. Margaret was among them, her chestnut hair unmistakable, her gaze empty but fixed upon her sister. Catherine and Josephine followed, their faces drained of life but carved with the faintest trace of sorrow, and though their mouths did not move, Sarah's lips whispered their names as if she heard them calling. Elizabeth collapsed to her knees in the grass, clawing at her mirror as if she could shatter the reflection and release her daughters, but the glass showed only herself, multiplied into endless, hollow-eyed doubles, staring back until she screamed and dropped it into the dirt. Josiah, staggering from drink and denial, hurled himself forward, seizing Sarah's arm with the desperation of a man who finally understood that all his power, all his land, all his gold meant nothing here, nothing against this ancient covenant. But when he touched her, his hand blistered as though pressed against flame, and Sarah only turned her head, her voice quiet and final. "You gave us to them." In that instant, Thomas fired his pistol, the explosion ripping through the night, but the bullet shattered before it reached the tree, fragments of lead falling useless into the grass, and then, without struggle, Sarah stepped beneath the oak, her figure remerging into the pale host that encircled the trunk, her face dissolving into that hollow-eyed eternity. The chorus fell silent, the air stilled, The oak stood unyielding, its shadow thicker than the night around it, and in that silence every living soul present knew the truth, that the Ellison daughters had not been taken by chance, nor by illness, nor by the foolish imagination of frightened women. They had been claimed. And the family's silence, their refusal to speak, their insistence on respectability and control, was the very offering that fed the tree. Magnolia Hill had not been cursed. It had been chosen. And those who inherit silence inherit the chains of the dead. The morning after Sarah's disappearance, Magnolia Hill was not a house of mourning, but of paralysis. Every room heavy with a silence that pressed harder than grief, for grief admits loss while silence denies it, and the Ellisons clung to denial as though it were the last defense of their collapsing power. Josiah ordered the servants to say nothing, to bury their words along with their terror, threatening whippings for anyone caught whispering of the night before. But commands cannot cage fear, and in the slave quarters the story spread like smoke through dry grass. How the master's daughters were being taken one by one, how the oak tree was no tree but a gate, and how the bloodline itself was the toll demanded by forces older than the Ellisons or Alabama itself. Elizabeth locked herself away, refusing food, her silver mirror gone from her possession, abandoned in the dirt where she had dropped it. But when Thomas attempted to retrieve it, he found only shattered fragments scattered in a perfect circle, as though broken not by a fall, but by deliberate design. Miss Porter fled the house within days, claiming sudden illness, yet her journal, later uncovered in the trunk of a distant cousin, revealed the truth. She had seen the covenant written not in parchment, but in repetition, a cycle consuming the daughters of the house because the patriarch had bound his bloodline to the soil, knowingly or not, when he claimed land the old men had warned him against. And here lies the darker revelation. Josiah Ellison was not unique. Across the South, across the so-called civilized world, families of wealth and power built their empires on ground already consecrated to something unseen, and in return, those powers demanded silence. You see, silence is the first weapon of control, a spell cast not with incantations, but with fear of speaking. The Ellisons enforced it brutally, forbidding questions, erasing memories, and in doing so, they became collaborators in their own undoing. This is how institutions, be they families, churches, or governments, sustain themselves, by ensuring that men and women swallow their screams, deny their visions, and accept the official narrative no matter what they witness with their own eyes. The Ellison's silence was not a private failing, but a template, one mirrored across centuries in and secrets are folded neatly beneath the weight of respectability, for nothing protects corruption more effectively than the insistence that nothing has happened at all, that the screams in the night are dreams, that the missing are simply absent, that the rot is only imagination. Magnolia Hill became a monument to that kind of silence, its facade unbroken, its fields still worked, its ledgers still balanced, and Josiah Ellison moved among his peers with the same iron pride as before, a man whose fortune remained intact even as his daughters were consumed one by one, because society would rather applaud the illusion of stability than confront the evidence of decay. Yet those who labored under his name, those forced to sleep within earshot of the oak, knew the truth and carried it in whispers from cabin to cabin, from field to field, until the story was no longer one man's shame, but a communal warning. The Master's house is built upon a pact with shadows, and shadows take their due. That is how power operates, not by honesty, but by silence weaponized, by turning witnesses into accomplices through fear of punishment, by convincing entire communities that to speak is more dangerous than to suffer. In this way, the Ellison covenant mirrors every great machinery of control, the church that silences the heretic, the state that silences the dissident, the family that silences the victim, each insisting that order depends on obedience, and obedience depends on silence. But silence, like debt, compounds across generations until the cost becomes unbearable, until the walls of the great house crack, until the earth itself demands an accounting. Magnolia Hill stood for decades more, its halls echoing with absence, its oak casting a shadow no sun could diminish, but those who passed by after Sarah's vanishing swore they heard singing at dusk, faint and feminine, rising not from Hugh, man throats, but from the ground itself, a reminder that no secret stays buried forever, and that what is repressed returns not as memory, but as hunger. The decay of Magnolia Hill did not announce itself in fire or ruin, but in the slow, invisible seep of rot that everyone sensed yet no one dared to name, the kind of corruption that does not shatter overnight but erodes year by year until foundations crumble under their own refusal to change. Josiah aged into a man of stone, his face set in a mask of authority that concealed the cracks spidering through his soul, and though his fields yielded cotton and his ledgers overflowed with profit, his household became a mausoleum where laughter had no place, where every creak of the floorboards and groan of the wind reminded its occupants of absences too dangerous to speak aloud. Elizabeth withered into a ghost long before death claimed her, drifting through corridors with eyes fixed on mirrors that no longer reflected her face, as if she too had been erased, absorbed into the covenant she had once tried to resist. Thomas carried his father's name forward, inheriting land, labor, and silence alike. And though he married and fathered children, the women of the line bore their births with dread, watching each daughter as though waiting for the clock to strike 16, waiting for the pull of the oak to claim what had been promised generations earlier. The community outside the estate turned its gaze away, for wealth commands blindness, and even those who suspected whispered their suspicions only behind closed doors, knowing that to accuse the Ellisons was to risk not just social exile, but the wrath of something beyond human authority. Thus the legend thickened, not by proclamation but by omission, by the refusal of church records to mention the vanished girls, by the absence of headstones in the family plot, by the way conversations faltered whenever their names were spoken. And here is the lesson buried in the Ellison tragedy. Silence is not merely the absence of speech, it is the architecture of power, a system so pervasive that it convinces even its victims to guard the very chains that bind them. Magnolia Hill endured because its master endured, and its master endured because everyone around him accepted the lie that endurance was survival, when in truth it was only submission. And so the house stood, its grandeur masking decay, its silence louder than any confession, a monument to the unspoken truth that what is not faced will always return, not as memory, but as inheritance. By the turn of the new century, Magnolia Hill was already spoken of in half-voices, a place where the veneer of gentility could not entirely disguise the shadow that clung to its halls, for while its columns still gleamed and its verandas hosted visitors who praised its enduring elegance, those who stayed too long within its walls reported a heaviness, a sense of being watched by eyes that never blinked, and some even claimed to hear the faint rustle of dresses in empty corridors, the hushed giggle of girls who should have been long dead. The Ellison family carried on outwardly, maintaining their social position, their political alliances, and their wealth. But within the lineage, the old fear continued to coil itself around every generation, for though some daughters reached adulthood and even bore children of their own, each birth was greeted not with joy, but with dread, as if the very act of producing another girl was to set a clock ticking toward an inevitable disappearance. Outsiders, journalists, and curious scholars sometimes tried to pierce the facade, asking why so many records of the family seemed incomplete, why church ledgers omitted the names of girls said to have lived there, but their inquiries were met with stone-faced denials, legal threats, or sudden withdrawals of hospitality. The land itself, however, remembered, and travelers passing by after dusk often spoke of a pale light lingering at the tree line, of voices too faint to be carried by air, of the oak's branches swaying in a pattern that resembled breath rather than wind. What made the Ellison curse most insidious was not the supernatural itself, but the collusion of silence that fed it, the way entire communities conspired to look away, to accept wealth and reputation as sufficient reason to swallow truth, and in doing so they became accomplices to the continuation of whatever covenant had been struck. Thus Magnolia Hill endured not merely as a haunted house, but as a living emblem of how denial ossifies into history, how silence becomes inheritance, and how generations are devoured not by what they confront, but by what they refuse to name. By the middle of the 20th century, Magnolia Hill no longer stood as a proud estate, but as a relic, its paint peeling, its verandas sagging, its windows clouded with the dust of decades. Yet the silence within it remained as intact as the day Sarah vanished. For silence does not crumble with wood or rust with iron, but lingers, unbroken, until it is named. Families came and went, tenants renting the house when the Ellison fortune waned, but none stayed long, citing illnesses that seemed to strike only daughters, strange dreams of suffocation beneath branches that reached through ceilings, or the steady impression that the walls themselves were listening. Local children dared each other to approach the oak at dusk, claiming they saw white figures pacing beneath its canopy, their faces blurred as though waterlogged, and though the town grew around it, paved roads, telephone lines, even the hum of passing automobiles, the tree remained untouchable, its roots knotted deeper than the earth's memory. Scholars from the university filed reports, noting the Ellison absences in genealogical charts, a repeated vanishing of female heirs with no record of death, burial, or marriage. But their findings were dismissed by local officials as clerical errors, mistakes in record-keeping, anomalies not worth pursuing. The truth was that Magnolia Hill had become more than a house. It was an institution of silence, a place where denial itself had been mortared into every beam, proof of how communities protect themselves not by confronting their demons, but by preserving them, feeding them, making them part of the landscape until no one remembers when the pact began or if it could ever end. And so, by the time historians began to dig in earnest, Magnolia Hill was already half devoured by its own history, its shutters banging like hollow lungs in the wind, its oak still standing with the essay, "Me, Unnatural Vigor," and in the journals left behind, fragmented, water-stained, half-burned. The pattern was clear. What vanishes does not vanish. It waits, and what is silenced does not die. It grows teeth. It was not until the latter half of the 20th century, when archives opened and the discipline of history itself turned toward the stories long buried beneath polite records, that fragments of the Ellison saga began to surface again, though even then the truth resisted clarity. For every document seemed to come with its own absences, its own mutilations, as though the silence had followed the family into ink and paper. Graduate students combing through probate records at the county courthouse found wills that mentioned sons by name, but referred to daughters only as issue or heirs unnamed. And one particularly determined researcher uncovered letters from Miss Porter's surviving relatives describing her sudden departure from Magnolia Hill, her refusal ever to discuss her years there, and her death in a sanatorium after what was called a prolonged nervous disorder. Local oral histories, gathered in the 1960s and 70s, added more flesh to the bones. Elders recalled their own grandparents warning children never to linger near the Ellison oak, never to answer if a girl's voice called from the fields at night, never to speak of the missing girls unless one wished to invite the same fate. As the pieces accumulated, a picture emerged, not just of a cursed family, but of a community complicit in sustaining that curse, for silence had always been the mortar holding the Ellison power in place, and silence had also been the cloak that allowed the legend to slip into folklore rather than accountability. By the time preservationists petitioned to list Magnolia Hill as a historic site, the house stood hollow and peeling, its floorboards warped, its mirrors spotted, its roof threatening collapse. Yet when the first team of architects and archivists walked its halls, they reported the same sensation described in journals more than a century earlier: the feeling of being watched, of hearing faint voices just beyond the range of comprehension, of the oak's shadow stretching through the windows, no matter the hour. What struck the investigators most, however, was not the supernatural suggestion, but the realization that Magnolia Hill was less a haunted house than a living record of silence itself, an institution built on repression, denial, and complicity, and that the true horror was not that the Ellison daughters were taken, but that for generations no one dared to say aloud that they were gone. By the early 21st century, the legend of Magnolia Hill had drifted to the margins of memory, surviving in scattered references, local ghost tours, and half-forgotten family gossip. Yet for those who pried at the silence with persistence, the story revealed itself less as folklore and more as a map of how entire systems protect themselves through erasure. Descendants of the Ellison line, many scattered far from Alabama, began to stumble upon fragments: an old letter sealed in a Bible, a photograph where one of the daughters appeared blurred while the rest of the family stood in sharp focus, a diary entry copied and recopied until the ink bled meaning from repetition, and some among them returned to the collapsing estate seeking answers, not out of belief in curses, but out of a hunger to break the pattern that had haunted their blood for 2 centuries. What they found was not only a decaying house and an oak tree still impossibly vital, its roots pushing through the foundation like veins of a buried giant, but also the palpable weight of generations who had chosen silence over truth, denial over acknowledgement, power over protection, and in that recognition they began to see Magnolia Hill not simply as their inheritance, but as a symbol of how silence is institutionalized, not just in families, but in nations, in churches, in schools, in governments, all of which preserve themselves by consuming what they refuse to admit exists. And so the return to Magnolia Hill became less a matter of haunting than of reckoning, for the oak stood not merely as a tree, but as an archive, its branches recording the names that were never spoken, its shadow sheltering the memories that were never mourned, and those who dared to stand beneath it felt the crushing truth that silence itself is alive, that it feeds, and that its hunger spans generations. When the descendants gathered at Magnolia Hill in what remained of the parlor, surrounded by flaking wallpaper and a ceiling that sagged like a tired lung, it was less a family reunion than a tribunal, though none of them dared name it as such, for even now the reflex of silence lived in their blood, urging them to smooth over, to forget, to defer. Yet the documents and whispers they had unearthed had made forgetting impossible, and so they sat together while the house listened. Outside, the oak spread its branches wider than seemed natural, as though straining to hear, and one of the cousins, a woman who had lost her own daughter years earlier without explanation, the child vanishing between rooms in a way no police report could describe without stuttering, stood and spoke aloud what none had yet dared. They are still here, and they are still waiting. The words broke something. The floorboards groaned, the shutters banged, and from somewhere deep in the earth came a low vibration, not thunder, not machinery, but a sound older than speech. In that instant they understood what their ancestors had always known but refused to acknowledge, that silence was not simply a habit of repression, but the very fuel that sustained the covenant, that each generation's refusal to speak had been an offering, feeding the hunger that lived beneath the oak. The realization pressed upon them that to break the silence was not merely to remember the lost girls, but to unravel the architecture of power itself, to dismantle the lie that had shielded the Ellisons for centuries, and that doing so might destroy them as well, for inheritance binds the guilty and the innocent alike. Still, one by one, voices joined, hesitant at first, then gathering force, names being spoken aloud for the first time in over 100 years: Sarah, Elizabeth, Margaret, Catherine, each utterance cracking the air like glass, Yes, each syllable making the walls tremble until the house itself seemed to exhale, and for the first time since its founding, Magnolia Hill was filled not with silence, but with the living roar of truth. The air inside Magnolia Hill thickened as the names multiplied, echoing against the cracked plaster until they seemed to peel layers of time away, and with each syllable the house convulsed, beams shuddering, dust raining down in pale clouds that glittered like ash. While outside the oak writhed as though caught in a storm no one else could see, its branches twisting in protest, its leaves rattling with a fury that was not wind, but resistance. The descendants felt it in their bodies, a weight loosening from their chests even as another force pressed harder, trying to choke the sound from their throats. And for a moment, it seemed possible the covenant would crush them for daring to undo centuries of silence. But then something shifted. A crack like a gunshot split the parlor floor, and from it rose not smoke or fire, but a chorus of voices, young and trembling yet insistent, the voices of the vanished daughters who had been waiting, sealed in the marrow of the house, their words, neither accusation nor plea, but release. A long exhalation of presence reclaimed. The shutters flew open, the mirrors shattered, and the oak outside let out a groan so deep it shook the soil, a death rattle of roots surrendering their grip at last. As the noise subsided, the silence that followed was not the oppressive hush that had reigned for generations, but something lighter, clean, as though the air itself had been purged. And those who remained standing in the wreckage understood that truth had not only freed the lost, but unbound them as well. Yet the victory was not without cost. Magnolia Hill lay broken, its walls split, its roof sagging, its grand facade reduced to ruin. And in its collapse, the descendants recognized the deeper lesson, that to shatter silence is to destroy the structures built upon it, that liberation demands demolition, and that what emerges afterward is not restoration, but the raw space in which something new might, at last, be built. In the weeks that followed the collapse of Magnolia Hill, the townspeople came to gawk at the wreckage, whispering among themselves about lightning strikes and foundation rot, clinging to explanations that would allow them to pretend the destruction had been ordinary. But those who had stood in the parlor knew better, for they carried in their ears the echo of voices once silenced, and in their bones the shudder of the oak's surrender. The tree itself did not topple, but withered suddenly, its leaves blackening and falling in heaps, even though the season was wrong, its trunk splitting open to reveal a hollow core, empty, as if something had finally departed, leaving behind only the husk of what had ruled for generations. The descendants who had broken the silence scattered afterward, some fleeing the county entirely, unwilling to remain where memory and ruin clung so heavily, while others stayed, compelled by a sense of obligation to tend the scarred land, to plant new growth where silence had once been cultivated. Stories spread as they always do, but with each telling the legend shifted. Some claimed the voices of the girls could still be heard in the wind on summer nights. Others, that the house's collapse had freed not just the Ellisons, but the whole town from a weight no one had admitted they carried. For the first time in living memory, people began to speak openly about the disappearances, about the complicity, about the way silence itself had been the true curse. And though speaking did not erase the grief or restore the lost, it altered the air, made it possible to imagine futures not bound to the old covenant. Magnolia Hill remained only as rubble and story, its ruin a reminder that what is built on denial cannot endure forever. And in the clearing where the oak had once cast its shadow, grass began to grow, tentative at first, but then wild and insistent. A green declaration that even after centuries of silence, the earth still remembers how to breathe. Decades later, when little remained of Magnolia Hill but scattered bricks, rusted nails, and the faint outline of its foundation swallowed by weeds, scholars and writers began to revisit its story. piecing together what fragments survived in letters, court records, and oral accounts. Yet they found themselves grappling less with ghosts than with the architecture of silence itself. For the ruin had become emblematic of how entire communities conspire to forget, how families rewrite memory to protect power, and how institutions thrive by consuming what they refuse to name. Local historians began to speak of the Ellison silence as more than a family curse, framing it instead as a parable for the broader American South, where histories of violence and disappearance were not anomalies but patterns, sustained not by supernatural forces but by collective refusal to acknowledge the truth. Visitors still came to the site, some drawn by tales of hauntings, others by a hunger to witness where silence had been broken, and many reported feeling a strange calm beneath the open sky, where the oak once stood, as though the air itself had been cleared by the act of naming. Descendants of the Ellisons occasionally returned too, some carrying flowers, others journals, each adding their own voice to a growing archive that transformed the ruin into a place of testimony rather than fear. Over time, Magnolia Hill ceased to be regarded as a haunted estate and instead became a lesson inscribed into the land, that silence is not absence but presence, not emptiness but weight, and that to confront it is to risk collapse, yet also to make room for breath, for growth, for futures unchained from the hunger of the past. And so, Magnolia Hill's story did not end with the fall of its walls or the death of its oak. For stories never end where the ground collapses. They move forward, carried in the breath of those willing to speak. And in that sense, the ruin became more alive in absence than it had ever been in grandeur. Across lectures, in classrooms, in whispered conversations between descendants and strangers alike, the tale of the Ellisons transformed into something larger than its soil, serving as a mirror for how silence festers wherever power demands it, whether in families that bury their shames, in churches that refuse to name their sins, or in nations that erase what threatens their myths. Magnolia Hill was remembered not only as a haunted place, but as a parable of inheritance, proof that silence itself can be passed down as surely as land or blood, and that to break it requires both risk and ruin. Visitors continued to tread the site, not searching for ghosts, but standing in the clearing as if to listen to the quiet that now breathed freely, a quiet no longer weighted with suppression but with possibility, and many left with the uneasy recognition that the true haunting of Magnolia Hill was not confined to Alabama, nor to one family's tree, but lived everywhere people choose to look away. For in the end, the lesson carved into its absence was simple and terrible, that silence has a hunger of its own, and if fed long enough, it will devour not just those who are silenced, but those who keep silent too. If there is an ending to Magnolia Hill, it is not in the ruin of the house or the hollowed oak, nor even in the voices finally spoken aloud, but in the recognition that silence itself is never confined to one family, one place, one history. It seeps, it travels, it settles wherever people decide forgetting is safer than remembering. And so the true legacy of Magnolia Hill lies in the uneasy truth that its curse is not unique but universal. The Ellison daughters, the vanished names, the complicit town, the scholars who pieced together fragments centuries later, all of them are only one version of a story that repeats itself endlessly in different guises, in different soils, in different languages, whenever power requires silence to survive. To stand in the clearing where the estate once loomed is to feel both the weight of what happened there and the unsettling recognition that such ground exists everywhere, in empty lots where houses once stood but are now erased from maps, in archives with pages missing, in families whose stories jump abruptly from one generation to the next without explanation. Magnolia Hill remains then, not as ruin or legend, but as warning. That silence is not absence, but a presence with teeth, and that unless confronted, it will build its own monuments, grow its own roots, and bind its keepers as tightly as its victims. The task of those who remember, whether by blood, by scholarship, or by chance encounter, is not to preserve the story in amber, but to keep speaking it, to break silence whenever it appears, to understand that the haunting never ends unless the truth is carried forward again and again into the light. And if you are reading these words now, if the story of Magnolia Hill has wound its way into your thoughts, then you too stand within its clearing, for every listener becomes part of its inheritance, carrying forward not the ruin of a house or the shadow of a tree, but the lesson that silence is never passive, never harmless, always complicit, always hungry, and the question it presses upon you is the same one that pressed upon the Ellison descendants when they gathered in the crumbling parlor. Will you keep quiet, letting silence consume what you fear to name? Or will you risk the shudder and the collapse that comes with speaking aloud what has been buried? The curse of Magnolia Hill was never supernatural but human, never rooted in soil, but in the refusal of mouths to open. And so the only power strong enough to end it was the fragile, dangerous act of voice. Perhaps that is why the story persists, why it lingers like a pulse in the dark, because it is less about a family long gone than about the living, about you, about me, about the choices we make every day to remain silent or to break it, to protect the structures built on denial or to let them fall so that something truer might grow. And so the haunting continues, not in Magnolia Hill, but wherever you choose not to speak, wherever silence tightens its grip, waiting, patient, eternal, until someone dares to open their mouth and let the names, the truths, the buried lives rise again into the air. And perhaps that is the final, most unsettling truth of Magnolia Hill, that it was never only about a crumbling estate in Alabama, nor about a cursed family line, nor even about the daughters whose names had been swallowed by the soil, but about the universal tendency of silence to cloak itself as protection, when in fact it is preservation only for the powerful, a weapon sharpened not by what is said, but by what is refused. And so the ruin becomes less a ghost story and more a mirror, reflecting back to each who encounters it. The silences they themselves have inherited, the gaps in their family histories, the pages torn from their national archives, the questions that tremble unsaid in their daily lives. And in that reflection, the haunting proves inescapable, for it follows not from place, but from practice, and no matter how far you are from the red dirt where Magnolia Hill once stood, you carry its echo in every moment you choose to turn away rather than speak. For silence, after all, is never neutral. It calcifies around wounds until they appear natural. It disguises absence as order. It convinces whole generations that forgetting is safer than remembering. And in doing so, it builds invisible walls as strong as stone, so that what happened at Magnolia Hill, daughters vanished, voices suppressed, a covenant sealed in denial, becomes simply one chapter in an endless pattern of histories consumed by omission, and the ruin left behind serves as proof that these structures cannot endure forever, that they will eventually split open under the weight of all they have swallowed. And yet the question that lingers like breath caught in the throat is whether we must wait for collapse each time, or whether we might instead dare to speak before the foundations crack, before the roots twist, before the silence has devoured too much to ever be restored. To speak, however, is never as simple as opening the mouth, for voice comes at a cost. Relationships strained, communities unsettled, institutions destabilized. And it is precisely that cost which silence pretends to spare us from, offering the comfort of continuity while exacting a deeper, hidden toll that accumulates over generations until it erupts, as it did at Magnolia Hill, in ruin and reckoning, so that the true burden of breaking silence lies not only in what must be said, but in what must be allowed to fall once it is spoken, and therein lies the enduring warning, that the longer silence is kept, the more violent its undoing will be, and yet to keep it forever is to consent to being consumed alive by it, leaving only the husk of what might have been if anyone had dared to speak sooner. And so, Magnolia Hill endures less as a place than as a question pressed upon each who encounters its story, for the ruin whispers that silence is itself an inheritance, sometimes carried unknowingly, sometimes clutched like a shield, always shaping what we believe can and cannot be said. And to inherit it is to stand at a threshold, to decide whether to extend its life by keeping still, or to risk the collapse that follows its breaking. And in this way, the estate becomes not a relic of the past, but a living covenant that renews itself wherever truth is deferred, reminding us that the haunting is never in the house, never in the oak, never even in the bloodline, but in the human choice to guard what should be confessed, and that every moment of hesitation, every swallowed word, every averted glance is another brick laid in a structure that will one day, inevitably, demand to be torn down. For the truth, once released, is unruly and cannot be managed like silence can. It does not obey the boundaries we try to impose. It does not respect the divisions of family or community or nation, but seeps through them all, widening cracks, unsettling myths, refusing to let what has been buried remain hidden. And though it may topple walls and scatter those who once clung to the safety of forgetting, it also clears the air in a way nothing else can. For in its rawness lies the possibility of beginnings, of voices no longer bound to secrecy, of lives no longer reduced to footnotes. And that is why Magnolia Hill, in the end, is not only a story of ruin, but also of emergence, a reminder that silence is a cage and truth a storm. And those storms bring devastation, they also leave the ground open, raw, and waiting for whatever dares to grow next. And perhaps that is the lasting power of Magnolia Hill, that even in its absence it insists upon presence, teaching that ruins are not merely remnants of what has fallen, but fertile grounds where memory takes root, that the collapse of silence is not an end, but a clearing, and that within that clearing each generation is offered a choice, to rebuild the old structures of denial, neat and orderly, and doomed to crumble again, or to let the land remain unsettled, open to the wild growth of truths once smothered, unruly and uncomfortable, but alive. For the true haunting was never the daughters' voices or the creaking beams, but the illusion that silence could protect, when in fact it was the very thing that consumed. And so to walk away from the story is not to leave it behind, but to carry its echo forward, a reminder that every silence maintained becomes another Magnolia Hill awaiting its collapse. And in this way, Magnolia Hill becomes less a tale of the past than a prophecy of recurrence, for wherever silence gathers unchecked, it begins the same slow work of hollowing, eating at foundations invisible to those who benefit from them, tightening its grip on those forced to endure it, until the day comes when a crack runs through the edifice and the voices once denied flood out with a force that can no longer be contained, scattering certainty, unraveling order, demanding witness. And so the ruin of the Ellison estate is not a singular tragedy, but a warning inscribed into the fabric of time, that silence always ends, whether broken deliberately by those brave enough to name what has been erased, or shattered violently when the weight of all that is hidden becomes unbearable. And in either case, the collapse is inevitable, leaving only the question of whether we will meet it with open mouths and steady breath, or be buried beneath the rubble of our own refusal to speak. And so the lesson lingers like a low hum beneath every act of forgetting, reminding us that silence is never passive, that it accumulates like pressure beneath the earth until it finds release, sometimes in whispers, sometimes in destruction, but always with consequence. And to live in its shadow is to gamble with inevitability, for no matter how carefully families or nations polish their facades, the fractures remain, waiting. And what Magnolia Hill makes clear is that the only choice we truly hold is whether to confront silence before it consumes us, or to let it grow unchecked until it tears through our lives in ways we can no longer control, leaving us to sift through ruins and wonder how we failed to hear the warnings in time. And if Magnolia Hill teaches anything beyond its own haunted soil, It is that silence is never empty, but always crowded with what has been denied, and that those denials shape us more than we care to admit, guiding what we believe is possible to speak, to remember, to pass down, so that when silence finally cracks open, it does not simply reveal what was hidden, but alters the very landscape of the living, rearranging identities, loyalties, even futures, and thus the ruin stands as both memorial and omen, a reminder that what we refuse to face does not vanish, but waits, patient and enduring, until the day it insists upon being known, and in that insistence we are confronted not only with the ghosts of others, but with the measure of our own willingness to tell the truth. And this, finally, is the inescapable burden Magnolia Hill presses upon anyone who lingers with its story, that silence is not simply the absence of words, but the architecture of erasure, a structure built and maintained by those who fear what the truth will dismantle, and therefore to challenge silence is never just an act of speaking, but of undoing, of loosening the beams and prying up the floorboards of the lives and institutions that have depended upon its concealment. And though such work is perilous and often lonely, it is also the only work that prevents us from becoming yet another ruin swallowed by denial, another cautionary tale left for strangers to excavate. And so the legacy of Magnolia Hill is not the decay of its house or the fall of its oak, but the demand that we recognize silence as an inheritance. We must choose either to carry forward or to break apart, knowing that whichever choice we make will shape not only what is remembered of us, but what is possible for those who come after. For every silence carried forward becomes a weight that bends time itself, distorting what descendants know of their past and therefore what they believe of their future. And this is why Magnolia Hill still matters, because its ruin demonstrates that what is unspoken never disappears, but instead thickens, seeping into language, into gesture, into the marrow of those who inherit it, until whole generations grow within a story that has been gutted of its truth, and they in turn pass down that absence as if it were fact, as if the gaps themselves were history. And so, to refuse silence is not merely an act of honesty, but an act of restoration, a return of what has been deliberately starved. And though it may feel like tearing apart the ground beneath our feet, it is in fact the only way to ensure that what grows next will not carry the same hunger that consumed Magnolia Hill.